The morning of my bridal shower, I burned my hand on the coffee maker. It wasn't bad, just a thin red line across two fingers, but I stood at the kitchen sink running cold water over it and thought, this is a sign. Not a bad one, just a reminder that everything worth having comes with a little pain first. I'd learned that a long time ago. My name is Hadley. I'm 31 years old. And 18 months ago, I married the love of my life in front of 47 people who showed up to celebrate us. I want to tell you about that day, but to understand what happened at that wedding, you need to understand what happened before it, and what my family spent years making me believe about myself. I was born with a condition called limb difference. My left arm ends just below the elbow. I've had it my whole life. I know nothing else. I learned to drive with one hand, type 70 words a minute, braid my own hair, and change a car tire. I've done all of it. It doesn't define me. But for my family, for my mother especially, it always did. My sister Josephine is 2 years older than me and by every account my family ever offered, the daughter they'd planned on. Tall, both arms, effortless in the way that pretty women sometimes are when the world has never given them a reason not to be. My mother used to call her the easy one. I heard it so many times I stopped flinching. I was the one we worry about. Not because I gave them reasons to worry. I graduated college with honors, worked my way up to a project manager position at a mid-sized logistics firm in Nashville, paid my own rent since I was 23. But none of that counted in the currency my family used. What counted was presentation. What counted was what the neighbors thought, what people at church whispered, what my mother's friends would say when she mentioned her daughters. Josephine gave her something to brag about. I gave her something to explain. I met Joel at a work conference in Atlanta 3 years ago. He was presenting on supply chain restructuring, and I was in the third row taking notes and thinking his slides were over-designed. We argued about logistics software over bad hotel coffee at the networking break and exchanged numbers because neither of us wanted to stop talking. He called me 2 days later. We dated long distance for 6 months before he relocated to Nashville. A year after that, he proposed on the back porch of a rented cabin in the Smoky Mountains, right as the sun was dropping behind the ridge and the air smelled like pine and cold water. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want to tell you what Joel is like, because you need to know who he is before the rest of this makes sense. He is the kind of man who notices when you're tired before you say it out loud, who fills your gas tank when he borrows your car and leaves it fuller than he found it, who spent an entire Saturday afternoon figuring out how to modify a kayak paddle grip because I mentioned once, casually, that I'd always wanted to try kayaking. He didn't tell me he'd done it. He just showed up with a kayak one morning and said, "Let's go." My family met him 4 times before his engagement. My mother was polite in the stiff way she reserves for people she's trying to evaluate. My father shook his hand and asked about his income twice. Josephine was warm in the way that made me nervous. Too warm, too quickly. Touching his arm when she laughed, leaning in slightly too close when he talked. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid. The bridal shower was held at my aunt's house, my mother's older sister, a woman named Frances, who has a beautiful home in Brentwood, and genuinely good intentions, and a tendency to let my mother run every event she's ever offered to host. By the time I arrived, my mother had rearranged the seating, redirected the caterers, and placed herself and Josephine at the center table. I was put near the kitchen. It wasn't subtle enough to call deliberate. That's the thing about this kind of treatment. It's always just plausible enough to dismiss. The table near the kitchen had perfectly good chairs. The lighting was fine. If I'd said anything, my mother would have looked at me with that particular expression she has, the one that means you're being difficult again, and I would have felt smaller for having said it. So I sat near the kitchen. I ate the food. I opened the gifts. I smiled until my face ached. Joel's mother, a woman named Harriet who drove up from Chattanooga, sat beside me the whole afternoon. She kept refilling my water glass and at one point leaned over and said quietly, "You doing okay, sweetheart?" I almost cried right there over a plate of cucumber sandwiches. The engagement party was worse. My parents insisted on hosting it themselves. I should have known. Any event they host, they control and control. With my mother, it's always about who stands where, who gets photographed, whose story gets told. Joel and I arrived together. Within 20 minutes, I watched my mother steer him away from me toward a cluster of her friends, with Josephine appearing at his elbow like she'd been waiting in the wings. She laughed at everything he said. She touched his arm again. She did that thing where she positions herself so she's always slightly between two people, which means the other person has to actively step around her to reconnect. Most people don't bother. Joe is not most people. He stepped around her twice. She repositioned twice. I watched from across the room holding a glass of sparkling water and understanding, for the first time with complete clarity that this was not me being paranoid. Later that night after we got home, I told him what I'd seen. I expected him to reassure me it was nothing. Instead, he set down his keys and said, "I know. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. Your sister has said some things to me. Not once, a few times. I didn't want to upset you before the wedding." He showed me the text. Josephine had messaged him 3 weeks earlier asking if he wanted to grab coffee and talk, saying she had concerns about Hadley she thought he should hear. He'd declined. She'd tried twice more, with different framings. I sat on our couch for a long time after that. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It wasn't rage. Not at first. It was something quieter and colder. The specific grief of having suspected something for years and then having it confirmed. Like being told the diagnosis you already knew was coming. The grief isn't for the news. It's for all the time you spend hoping you were wrong. My mother called me the next morning, not to ask how the party went, to tell me that Josephine had mentioned she felt pushed out of the wedding planning and that I should make more of an effort to include her. I held the phone away from my face for a moment. Then I said, "I'll think about it," and hung up. I did not think about it. The weeks before the wedding were the strangest of my life, full of joy and dread in equal measure, like two rivers running alongside each other that refused to mix. Joel and I had dinner with his parents twice, and those evenings felt like exhaling. We finalized our vows, chose our first dance song, argued pleasantly about centerpieces. All of it was good and real and mine, and underneath it the other thing. My father calls one Tuesday evening in what I can only describe as a coordinated effort. He said he'd been thinking, and that he wanted me to understand that Joe was a good man, and that sometimes good men need a partner who won't hold them back. He paused after that, like the sentence would land gently if he gave it enough air. I said, "What exactly do you think I'm holding him back from, Dad?" He said, "I just mean life is complicated, Hadley. For someone like you. Someone like you." I have heard that phrase in 100 forms over 31 years, and it has never once meant something kind. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I said, "I have to go," and ended the call. Then I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down everything: the party, the texts, the phone calls, the years of smaller things before them. Not because I needed to remember, because writing it down made it real in a way that was useful. Evidence, a record. Joe found me at the table an hour later. He read what I'd written. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I want to show you something," and pulled out a folder from his laptop bag that I hadn't seen before. Inside was a document, a legal one, drawn up by his family's attorney in Chattanooga. He'd started the process 2 months earlier, after the first text from Josephine. It outlined our shared assets, protected mine independently, and included a clause specifically designed to ensure that no family pressure from either side could affect what we'd built together. He said, "I wasn't sure when to show you. I just wanted you to know it existed." I looked at the folder for a long time. I said, "You did this 2 months ago." He said, "I did it when I understood what we were dealing with." We were married on a Saturday in October. The venue was a renovated farmhouse event space about 40 minutes outside of Nashville. Exposed beams, string lights, open fields going golden in the fall. We'd chosen it together and I loved every inch of it. 81 guests. A 4-piece band that knew how to read a room. My dress had long sleeves and an open back, and I had found it on a rack at a small boutique in East Nashville on a Tuesday afternoon with my best friend, and I had known immediately. My parents came. Josephine came. I had not rescinded the invitations because I'm not the kind of person who burns things down for the satisfaction of it. I believed in the version of that day that I'd planned, and I was not going to let their presence reduce it. I was in the bridal suite getting ready when Josephine knocked on the door and came in without waiting for an answer. She said I looked beautiful. She said it the way people say things they don't mean. Correctly, but without warmth, the words landing like objects placed down rather than given. Then she said, "I hope you know what you're doing, Hadley. He's a lot for anyone. I just worry sometimes that you're not thinking about what this means long term." I looked at her in the mirror. I didn't turn around. I said, "Josephine, I need you to leave this room." She opened her mouth. I said it again. She left. My maid of honor, a woman I've been friends with since college, one of the most quietly fierce people I have ever known, locked the door after her, and then handed me my bouquet without a word. I took a breath. I straightened up. I looked at myself in that mirror, in that dress with that bouquet, and I made a decision right there about the rest of the day. Nothing that happened next was going to take it from me. The ceremony was held outdoors, just beyond the main barn. Rows of white chairs on either side of a grass aisle. October light, the kind that comes in at an angle and turns everything slightly gold. Joel stood at the end of that aisle and watched me walk toward him, and he looked like a man who understood exactly what he was watching. The officiant, a friend of Joel's family who'd known him since childhood, had just begun when my mother stood up. I heard a murmur move through the crowd before I understood what was happening. Then I saw her, standing in the third row on my side, and my father standing beside her, and Josephine a half step behind them. My mother said, loud enough to carry, "We can't let this happen." The officiant stopped. Joel turned toward them. Everyone turned toward them. My mother said, "This isn't right. There are things that need to be said." Joel deserves to make this decision with full information. She said it like she was doing someone a favor, like she had arrived to rescue a man who did not want to be rescued. I stood at the altar and I felt the old familiar pulley, the one I'd felt my entire life, to shrink, to apologize, to somehow make myself smaller so that the people around me would be more comfortable. I didn't. I stood completely still and I looked at my mother and I waited. What happened next was not Joel. It was his best man. A man named Curtis, who has known Joel for 15 years and who had, as I would learn later, been briefed on the full situation the week prior when Joel told him everything and asked him to be prepared. Curtis stepped forward from where he stood beside Joel. He was calm in a way that still impresses me when I think about it. Not angry, not dramatic, just clear. He said, "I'd like to say something, if that's okay." He turned to face my mother and my father and my sister. He said, "I've known Joel since we were 19 years old. I've watched him make a lot of choices, and I can tell you with complete certainty that he has never made one more deliberately or more carefully than this one. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's been ready for this for a long time." He paused. "You've said what you came to say. It's time to sit down." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My father sat down first. Then my mother. Josephine sat down last, and when she did, I watched something shift in the rows around her. Not judgment exactly, but a kind of collective exhaling. Several people who had come as my parents' guests chose, visibly and deliberately, not to look at them. Joel's uncle, sitting in the front row on the other side, started clapping. Slowly at first, then his wife joined him. And then it moved through the rows like a wave until most of the crowd was applauding, not for the drama but for Curtis, for the fact that someone had simply said the true thing out loud, and that was enough. The officiant, bless him, straightened his notes and said, "Shall we continue?" We continued. When Joel and I exchanged our vows, I had written mine myself. I had written them 3 times and each time thrown them out because they didn't sound like me, and the 4th time I wrote them at 1 in the morning at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I kept them because they finally did. I told him that I had spent a long time believing that love was something I would have to earn differently than other people, that there would always be a version of me that wasn't quite enough, not quite easy enough, not quite simple enough, not quite the version someone would choose without qualification. I told him he had been the first person in my life who'd never once made me feel that way, not because he ignored who I was, but because he saw it, all of it, and chose it on purpose, repeatedly, without making it a point of pride. I told him I planned to spend the rest of my life doing the same for him. He cried. He told me later he'd promised himself he wouldn't. I found that enormously satisfying. At the reception, my parents left before the first dance. I know because my Aunt Frances told me afterward, and because I noticed the table where they'd been sitting was empty when Joel and I came in. I don't know what they said to each other on the way to the car. I don't know if they felt regret or vindication or something they haven't named yet. What I know is that I danced with my husband for the first time as his wife in a room full of people who had chosen to stay. The band played a song we'd picked on the rainy Wednesday evening, sitting on the kitchen floor with a glass of wine and a shared phone, listening to clips until we found the one that felt right. It felt right in the room too. It felt like something true. Curtis found me during the cocktail hour, and I hugged him and he said, "I practiced that speech 6 times in my bathroom mirror, in case you were wondering." I said, "It landed." He said, "Good. Joe told me to be ready." I was ready. Joel's mother danced with me during the second set and held my hand, my left one, the short one, the whole time, which is not something people always know to do, and which meant more than I had words for in that moment. My maid of honor gave a toast that made half the room laugh and the other half reach for their napkins. It contained no reference to my family at all. It was purely about me and Joel and the Tuesday we'd called her from Atlanta to tell her we were engaged and how she'd screamed so loud the neighbors knocked to check on her. It was perfect. At the end of the night, Joel and I stood outside the barn while the last guest said goodbye. The October air had gone cool and the string lights inside were still on, casting warm shapes across the grass. He put his arm around me and we stood there without talking for a while, just watching the last of it. He said, "You okay?" I thought about the question honestly, the way I'd learned to do. I said, "Yes." "Actually, yes," he said, "good." I said, "Curtis practiced in the bathroom mirror." He said, 6 times. He told me. We laughed. It was the easy kind, the kind that happens when the hardest part is already behind you and you're only just realizing it. I have thought about that day many times since then. I've thought about my mother standing up in the 3rd row and what she expected would happen. Whether she thought I would stop the ceremony, whether she thought Joel would turn to her and thank her, whether she had rehearsed what came next, or whether she had simply acted on the certainty that she was right and that certainty would be enough. I've thought about the moment I decided not to shrink. I can't tell you it was heroic. It didn't feel heroic. It felt like holding a railing on a very steep staircase. Not brave, just necessary, just not letting go. My sister has not contacted me since the wedding. My mother sent a card at Christmas with a gift card inside and a note that said, "Hoping this year brings you happiness." I sent a thank you note because I was raised to. My father called on my birthday and left a voicemail that I have not returned. I don't know what the future of those relationships looks like. I think about it. I don't lose sleep over it the way I once would have. What I know is this. I spent 31 years being told, in ways loud and quiet, direct and implied, that I was the version of a daughter that needed to be apologized for. That I was the harder one, the complicated one, the one who made things more difficult simply by existing in the way I exist. I no longer believe that. I'm not sure I fully believed it even then. But now I have evidence, the concrete, specific, daily kind, that it was never true. I have a man who modified a kayak paddle on a Saturday afternoon without telling me. I have a best friend who locked the door without being asked. I have a best man who practiced in front of a bathroom mirror 6 times so he would be ready when it mattered. That's what I carried out of that farmhouse on an October evening with the string lights still on and the band playing one last song inside. Not vindication, not victory. Just the simple, solid knowledge that I had been seen, fully, clearly, and without qualification, by the people who mattered. That was enough. That was everything. I spent a lot of time thinking about what it actually means when someone tries to take something from you in public. Not quietly, not privately, but in front of everyone you love, at the moment you've worked hardest toward. My mother didn't stand up in that 3rd row because she was afraid for Joe. She stood up because she had spent 31 years believing that her discomfort with who I am gave her the right to decide what I deserved. That's not love. That's ownership dressed up in the language of concern. And here's what I've come to understand about that kind of thinking. It collapses the moment the person it's aimed at refuses to confirm it. I didn't collapse, not because I'm exceptionally strong. I've had plenty of moments where I was anything but. I didn't collapse because somewhere along the way I had quietly, privately decided that I was going to stop letting other people's limitations become my identity. That decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in 100 small moments over years. Every time I finished something I was told I couldn't. Every time I showed up anyway. Every time I chose not to explain myself to someone who had already decided not to listen. What Josephine did, the texts, the positioning, the last-minute visit to my bridal suite, says nothing about me. It says everything about what she believed she was owed, simply by being considered the easier version of a daughter. And what my parents did, standing up at my wedding ceremony to voice doubt they had rehearsed and dressed as care, tells me that they had never fully reckoned with the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. Those are not the same thing. They feel the same to the person doing them, but they land completely differently on the person receiving them. Curtis didn't stand up and give a speech because he's dramatic or because he wanted a moment. He stood up because Joel had trusted him with the truth and asked him to be ready, and Curtis had taken that seriously enough to practice in front of a bathroom mirror 6 times. That's what integrity looks like in ordinary life, not grand gestures, but showing up prepared when preparation is the thing that's needed. Joel drew up legal documents 2 months before our wedding. Not because he doubted us, because he saw clearly what we were dealing with and he chose to protect what we were building, rather than hope the threat would go away on its own. That's what clear-eyed love does. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't wait to see how bad it gets. It acts quietly and without fanfare in the direction of the people it's committed to. I think about the version of me who might have stood at that altar and apologized, who might have turned to my mother, nodded, stepped aside. I understand that version. I was her for a long time, but understanding her doesn't mean going back to her. What I know now is that the life you build belongs to you, not to the people who raised you, not to the people who doubted you, not to anyone who decided before you walked into the room what category you belonged in. The only people who get to weigh in on what you deserve are the ones who have actually taken the time to see you, fully, clearly, without needing you to be easier. Joel saw me. Curtis showed up. My best friend locked the door. The rest took care of itself.